Boldwood presents The Last Wife, written by J. A. Baker and read by Janine Burkett and Simon Mattax. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Faith is the bird that feels the light when the dawn is still dark. Rabindranath Tagore. Prologue. With hindsight, I should have gone with that inescapable gut instinct that gnawed at me on the journey there. The one that I duly ignored, pushing it away every time it reared its head. I should have persuaded Neil we had made a grave error of judgment and persuaded him to stay on the ferry for the return journey back home. So many things we should have done, but didn't. So many things I shouldn't have done, but did. There were too many words unsaid between us, too few conversations, and definitely too many ill-thought-out actions. We should have turned around and gone back home. That was the thing. Not that we had a home to go back to. Having sold it, our possessions shipped out 4 weeks prior, after being put into storage for a month. But we didn't turn around because I didn't say or do anything. Instead, I just stood there, mute, fingers clasped around the metal railings, hands numb from the cold, and ignored that small, still voice in my head, the one that continually told me something was amiss with this whole venture, that something was about to go horribly wrong. Sometimes it's easier, isn't it? To ignore the subtle signs, to quell those nuanced voices inside your head and be carried along with the original planned agenda. Having to endure the upheaval of suddenly refusing to align to a prearranged schedule takes courage. Nobody likes upsetting the apple cart, least of all me. I was also feeling weak, shattered actually. I didn't have it in me to tell Neil that I'd changed my mind, that we were making a big mistake. I had no reasons to give, no tangible evidence to present to him. Just that low rumbling of discontent that swirled about in my gut, making me feel queasy and out of kilter. And yet, despite my misgivings, despite the turmoil that whirled in my head, I had to admit that it looked so beautiful that night as we sailed towards our new home. The dark water, the rugged coastline, the neat rows of rooftops in the distance, the twinkling line of streetlights that flanked the roadside next to the ferry point. They were mesmerising. How intriguing it all was, how magical and exciting, how utterly terrifying and frighteningly deceptive. Would we have stayed had we known what lay ahead? Probably not. Our first reaction would have been to turn around and head back to the place we knew so well, back to the town where we both grew up. The same place where we made our terrible mistake. Do we regret making the decision to sell our lovely home and move to a remote island off the northeast coast of England? Strangely enough, no. Why? Because we survived what took place on Winter's End Island, and we both lived to tell the tale. We're still here, living and breathing. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, isn't that how the old adage goes? Living on Winter's End changed us. Whether that's for the better or not, I guess only time will tell. Part 1. Chapter 1. Christ, it's so cold here. What happened to the summer? Neil stared up at the sky, shoulders hunched, eyes narrowed against the strong northeasterly breeze that lapped around our faces. It was freezing, there was no denying it. I wondered if Neil was also having second thoughts, voicing his innermost doubts to me, skirting, as we always did, around the edges of the problem without saying what we actually meant. Perhaps I should have taken more notice, seized the opportunity to tell him how I was feeling, reassured him that to be reticent and frightened was okay, that it wasn't a sign of weakness and that I was feeling it too. "It's not so bad," I replied, trying to mask my own fears and angst, thinking that living on an island out in the middle of the North Sea was probably going to test the pair of us both physically and mentally. I knew then that speaking openly about what was burrowing deep within my brain wouldn't work at that point. It had been my idea moving here. I had seen the cottage for sale online and was immediately attracted to it, the longing to escape from events of late pushing me on, giving me the impetus to run away from everything I knew and loved. I wanted to draw a line under it all, start afresh. I wasn't running away, I was simply starting again. That's what I told myself. Everyone deserves a second chance, don't they? Even me. Especially me. And yet, as we stood there discussing the weather, wondering where the late summer heat had gone to, something in the pit of my stomach continued to flap about whenever I thought about what we were doing. What we were about to take on. I squashed down those feelings, told myself that everything was too far down the line to make any major changes. I needed this new venture, was unable to go back to my old life, to face my family and friends after what I had done. Putting some distance between us was important to me, if only to save face and help keep my dignity intact. Their memories of me might fade. What I did would always be there. A stark reminder of how a few minutes of stupidity and being driven by fear and desperation could alter the trajectory of our entire lives. I slipped my hand into Neil's, his fingers dry and cold against mine. "Come on," I said, trying to inject some levity into my tone. "Let's get back inside, get a coffee. If we're lucky, they might even have some cake on offer." I sounded positive. I didn't feel it, but then again, lying had become my default mode. I was practically an expert. We walked back inside the ferry, through the automatic doors, away from the rough, dark water outside, away from the biting cold that stung at our exposed hands and faces, and back into the relative warmth of the old vessel that would transport us to our new lives. We sat at a table that had seen better days. Brown tea-ring stains littered its surface, the corners of the laminate top curled up at the edges, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered at that point except arriving. We were almost there, almost at winter's end, where everything would be better, brighter. It had to be. It certainly couldn't be any worse than the life we had left behind. The life that I had ruined. "I'll get them," Neil said, as he stood up and walked towards the small serving area, where a young lad stood staring out into the vast blackness outside, boredom oozing from him in bucket loads. He had probably done this trip 100 times before, and was counting down the hours and minutes until he was on dry land again, home safe and sound and away from the whirring of the engine. Away from the bland, needy faces of demanding customers and the inescapable, lingering smell of stale food. Neil returned minutes later, carrying 2 large cups of coffee, tendrils of steam misting his face as he walked towards me. I thought about how patient he had been throughout all of this, adapting without question, sticking by me, forgiving me, just as I had forgiven him. We were made for one another, the two of us, locked together in our vast pit of transgressions.
A flat white for you and a cappuccino for me.
We both managed a small laugh. Before us sat 2 large mugs of pale brown liquid that could barely pass as coffee at all. A gathering of creamy foam clung to the sides of my cup. My stomach roiled as a large wave caught us unawares, sending my drink sliding away from us. I grabbed at it and watched as brown splashes of liquid spread across the table. Neil pulled a tissue out of his pocket and mopped up the spots of coffee, always helpful, always uncomplaining. But then, what I had done wasn't completely down to me. He played his part as well. We were in this thing together, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. I sighed. The irony of those words wasn't lost on me.
Everything okay?
He caught my eye, gave me a sly wink, his smile slightly lopsided. Even after everything we'd been through, all the trauma we had endured, an event that would have pushed many couples apart, he still had the ability to stop me in my tracks, make my heart flutter ever so slightly. His turquoise eyes, his clear chestnut-brown complexion erasing my worries. Until I looked away, stared out at the never-ending expanse of sea, that is. And then they returned, the tumult of emotions that ballooned in my head day after day, week after week. I was feeling fragile and needed him by my side to steady me, to remind me to get up every day and put one foot in front of another, to just keep going, to keep on keeping on. I closed my eyes for a second, told myself to stop it, that I should embrace this moment, remember it as a turning point, the catalyst that would help repair our broken lives. It was a positive, constructive thing we were doing, moving to the island. It had to be. All other avenues were closed off to us, our options severely limited. If we didn't make a go of this, then we would be right back where we started, with nothing, all eyes feasting on the wreckage of our lives like vultures picking over a carcass. And I refused to let that happen. To be the talk of the area, shuffling around the place, wearing our misfortune like some sort of leper's bell. My dignity was important to me. To lose face would mean losing everything.
Look,
Neil said softly, his finger pointing beyond my shoulder.
The lights are getting closer. We're almost there.
I spun around, my heart beginning to speed up, and stared out at the sprinkling of neon lights amidst the surrounding black water and starless dark sky. I needed this new beginning. It held such promise for me, for us, and yet my gut was continually telling me that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the sense of isolation that was getting to me, trying to tear me down, my brain refusing to let me feel anything other than fear and trepidation. They had become an intrinsic part of me, and I struggled to shake them off. Winter's End was a small island in the middle of the North Sea. It was different to anywhere I had ever lived before, different even to the coastline on the northeast, to the town I had loved so well, the town we were now leaving behind. Deep down, I knew that it wasn't the idea of being on an island in the middle of the sea that was getting to me. I had no idea what it was that was making me feel unsettled, but I did know that I had to suppress those fears and try to forge a new life for ourselves, make new friends, be part of the community, be a happy couple once again. The judgmental faces of my family and friends sprang into my mind. The stricken expression of my parents as I explained to them what had happened, what I had done. How, with their help, I could escape without getting a criminal record. Moving to Winter's End was our chance to put all that behind us, all those dark memories. A chance for Neil and me to reinvent ourselves, be the best that we could be, not the miserable, despondent couple that we had inadvertently morphed into.
Let's head down to the car, shall we? Don't want to hold anybody up behind us. Make ourselves the most unpopular people on the island before we've even begun, eh?
His eyes sparkled, and I knew he was trying to settle my doubts and reservations with his effervescent wit and charm. It wasn't working. Besides, the ferry was almost empty. Just a handful of people who looked tired and weary. Hardly a throng of locals. And anyway, most of them looked like holiday makers with their backpacks, off to spend the weekend in a remote cottage somewhere on the island, off to lose their problems and leave the rest of the world behind them. If only for a couple of days. It didn't work like that. Problems rarely, if ever, disappear. They mount up, increasing 100-fold, until they're tackled head-on. I should know. I took a final sip of my coffee and nodded. We stood up and headed out of the canteen area towards the stairs, my stomach doing somersaults as we descended into the bowels of the ferry where our car sat, its bright red paintwork a refreshing sight amidst the gloom and darkness. The place stank of exhaust fumes, poisonous gases trapped within the confines of the lower deck. A tension of opposites tugged at me. I couldn't wait to disembark, and yet something within me screamed to stay put. A handful of people began to filter towards their vehicles, everyone looking tired and mildly nauseated as the sea continued to buffet us about. This was the tail end of summer on Winter's End, the vestiges of the warmest and kindest season of the year still hanging around, and yet the weather appeared to be doing its damnedest to punish us. I didn't want to think about how gruelling the winters would be on this small island, focusing instead on what lay ahead, convincing myself of how exciting it could all be, how beautiful our little cottage would be once we settled in there, how making new friends would be such a challenging yet exhilarating experience. New start, new life. That was my mantra. The thing I would use to help me through this major upheaval. I mean, how many people had suffered greater changes than this in their lives and survived? We would do the same. I thought about my great-grandmother, who had lived through 2 world wars. My grandparents and parents, who had all grown up in abject poverty, living hand to mouth for most of their childhoods. I had been lucky. No wars, enough to eat, loved always. I had had a blessed existence thus far. But you ruined it, didn't you? I swallowed and turned to smile at Neil. He pointed the key fob towards our car and pressed it, our vehicle responding, its elongated beep echoing around us with an eerie howl. "We're lucky in so many ways, Fiona," he said huskily, as we clambered into our seats, me shivering against the cold of the leather upholstery, my breath misting in front of me. "We've got a nice, warm, dry house waiting for us. A car to drive us there and enough money to be able to eat. We'll be just fine." Even though his saccharine sweet attitude often irritated me, I hoped he was right. We didn't ever speak openly about the huge risks we had taken to get to this point. The friends we had lost, the family who had ostracised us. So many sacrifices, so many mistakes. All we had was each other. We had to make it work. His flesh felt warm against mine when I reached over and placed my fingers over his hand. The solidity of it a reassuring presence. I needed it, that sense of comfort. And because I needed to convince myself that everything would be fine, I believed him, fervently hoping that things would turn out for the best. My self-esteem was flagging, trailing down in the dirt, events of late continually reminding me of what a bad wife I was, a bad sister and daughter, a terrible employee, the worst.
Come on, let's get that heater whacked up. This place is bloody Baltic. God knows what life is going to be like here in winter.
He finished his sentence with a smile, making sure I noticed it. Saw that he was being sardonic and humorous. I'd forgotten what it felt like, the sensation of spontaneous laughter as it emerged unbidden, that spark of unprompted happiness exploding into the world around me. Maybe we would reach that point again. Maybe we would relax and find our feet and just be ourselves, our behaviour reflexive and effortless, not the contrived and strained actions of a couple who had dodged a bullet. We could once again become the couple that we once were, trouble-free, untethered and soft in the middle. Some might even say naive. Regardless, I wanted to be that person again, to act without having to think it through beforehand, my motions unrehearsed and natural. The flow of traffic off the ferry was smooth and unchallenging, and we were on the road within 5 minutes of docking up. The tiny lanes of Winter's End a far cry from what we were used to. We weren't big city slickers, far from it. But this tiny island was different to anything we had ever encountered before. Everything smaller and less frenetic. A sleepy outlier, that's what it was. Separate from the rest of the country. Exactly how I wanted to be. The sat-nav says we're only 6 minutes away, I said, thinking how unfamiliar it all looked in the darkness. The towering hedgerows like eerie spectres, hemming us in on all sides.
I think I know the route there, actually,
Neil said, his driving steady and effortless as we manoeuvred our way through the snaking lanes and onto a wider road that, although bigger, was still very narrow and shrouded in darkness.
I studied it on Google Maps, and anyway, it's not as if this place is big enough to get lost on, is it?
He was right. At only 6 miles long and 4 miles wide, whichever route we took, it would always lead us back to the sea. I stared out of the window and shivered. It was impossible to separate the land from the sky, the horizon a thick blanket of darkness that stretched as far as the eye could see. Clouds hid the stars, and only a tiny sliver of a watery moon was visible above us, a hazy grey crescent hanging languorously in a swathe of black. I hope the estate agent left the heating on. I had emailed him before we left, explaining that we wouldn't get here until after dusk. I prayed he had read it. The thought of stepping into an ice-cold cottage that would take hours to heat filled me with gloom. Already I was feeling tired, and that was before we had unpacked our cases and found the bed sheets and quilts. So much to do, I murmured, the words escaping before I could stop them. It feels never-ending.
We'll manage.
Neil glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the road ahead, his gaze fixed on the vast swathe of blackness that scared me so much.
He said he was leaving a welcome basket, so we should at least have something decent to eat.
His fingers tapped at the steering wheel, a dull rhythmic sound filling the space around us.
Once you get some food inside you and we get that fire going, things'll seem a lot easier, you'll see. Don't get overwrought. We don't want—"
He stopped mid-sentence, his words trailing off. We both knew what he was going to say. "We don't want you making yourself ill again, do we?" He was right. I was looking for problems that weren't there, preempting situations, making things worse. It had been a long day and I was tired after packing up the rest of our belongings, saying goodbye to friends and the remaining family members who were still talking to us, and getting to the ferry point. Small things that took on gargantuan proportions in my head. Small things that would leave a lasting impression on us. Or on me, that is. Neil seemed to be on an even keel, letting it all happen around him, remaining calm and unruffled while I felt afraid and rudderless, with no real place to call home.
"The Wi-Fi'll be a day or two to set up, but at least we've got electricity, and once that roaring fire gets going, it'll be just like home."
"That's because it is home, Neil. This is our life now, where we live and work and socialise. Winter's End is our life now. No changing our minds or going back, this is it." I tried to keep the sense of dread that I felt out of my voice, but it managed to find a way in, muscling its way past the small bursts of excitement that kept bubbling up inside me. They were bullies, the dark emotions that festered in my gut, elbowing any happiness and optimism out of the way. Maybe I deserved to feel unhappy. Maybe moving to Winter's End was my penance for what I had done. Maybe, I thought as we turned a sharp corner into the lane that led to our small cottage, I should cheer up and stop seeing this move as a bad thing. I was miserable and anxious, I knew that. Problem was, I didn't know how to snap out of it. Neil was a patient man, but he had his breaking point, and me being permanently morose could be the straw that would break this particular camel's back. I needed him. He needed me. I leaned forwards, ran my fingers through his hair, and planted a soft, dry kiss on his stubbly cheek. A good night's sleep is what I need. Everything'll feel much brighter in the morning. Chapter 2. I was right, I thought contentedly, as I stretched my limbs and yawned, unfurling myself like an animal coming back to life after a long hibernation. My back ached when I turned over to see Neil lying staring at me, a suggestive twinkle in his eye. A new day had dawned, and things did seem brighter. I sighed, laughed a little, and moved his hand away from my thigh. My libido, a waning thing that reared its head rarely since that time. He groaned and rolled onto his back. "I'll end up a frustrated old man, you know." I shot him a look that said, "Don't even go there." It was something we never talked about, our almost non-existent sex life. He winked at me and leaned up on his elbows, his skin the colour of honey in the dim early morning light. "I'll make us some breakfast. Will scrambled eggs do you?" My voice sounded disembodied. It echoed in my head. A reminder that I was keen to get away, keen to avoid a conversation about sex or the lack of it. I wasn't ready, not yet. Having sex meant relaxing and enjoying myself. I couldn't recall the last time I'd felt relaxed, both mind and body supple and yielding. He nodded and slumped back down onto the pillow while I pulled on my dressing gown, wrapping it tightly around my body against the chill of the room and tying it in the middle. It had taken all night for the cottage to heat up. As predicted, the estate agent had indeed left us a package of food, but neglected to turn up the thermostat, resulting in us being greeted with a blast of cold air when we unlocked the old wooden front door and stepped inside.
"It needs a name."
Neil sat up in bed and looked around at the sloping ceiling and ancient oak beams.
"Something romantic and evocative to honour its past."
"The cottage?" I frowned. We had enough to keep us busy without adding to the ever-growing list of jobs that demanded our attention. Naming this place was low on my list of priorities.
"It used to be a forge, apparently, many moons ago."
"Well, there you have it," I said, making my way out of the room, my stomach calling to me that it needed filling. "The forge, nice and easy, all sorted."
"Too easy,"
Neil shouted as I made my way down the narrow, winding stairs and into the kitchen.
"We need something more original than that. I'll put some thought into it."
I set about making us both some breakfast, leaving him to mull over fitting names for our new abode. I slotted bread into the toaster and whisked eggs, adding a dash of pepper before pouring them into the old skillet that I found at the back of one of the cupboards. I placed it on the hob with a clank, the sheer weight of it causing my hands to shake when it landed on the gas ring. Soft morning sunshine filtered through the kitchen window, wrapping its comforting arms around me, while I stood next to the cooker and stirred the eggs. My mind wandered, my eyes drawn to the garden. It wasn't so much of a garden as a large patch of scrubby wasteland that hadn't been cleared for God knows how many years. It was big, however, workable and full of potential, bigger than the garden we had left behind in our old house at Saltburn. That had been pretty enough, but had no room for expansion, just a small, neat square of green with potted plants lining the perimeter. Maybe that was something we could consider in the future, adding an extension to the cottage, pushing out the walls a little, having extra bedrooms, maybe even a bigger modern kitchen. I stopped, bit at my lip. Too early, too soon. I was thinking like Neil. Still, I knew that land was cheaper here, so it was a possibility for the future, but not yet. One step at a time. I tried to focus on the positives and what we had now, not what we could acquire in the future. Not many people would be willing to up sticks and move somewhere this remote, but we had done it. I suppose that was something we should be proud of. Neither of us were big risk-takers, me especially, so I guessed I should have been feeling gratified at the change in our lifestyle. We had done it. We were here. Not big risk-takers. Apart, that is, from those times when I had overstepped the mark, taken great strides towards possible oblivion. The eggs began to sizzle. I gripped the wooden spoon tightly and stirred them. Then buttered the toast, secretly enjoying the process of making our first meal in our new house. Above me, I heard Neil's footsteps as he wandered about the bedroom, getting showered and dressed, the thud of his movements a reassuring presence. I hoped he could locate something to wear. With most of our possessions still boxed and packed up, we would have to make do with the clothes we travelled in. Today I planned on unpacking, cleaning up, and getting as much of our items in place as I could, making this place feel like home. I knew it would take me a long time to come round to the idea of living here, but I had to try. Seeing our own things dotted about, the familiarity of having them around would help. I spent the next 5 minutes or so getting used to the new kitchen, trying to familiarise myself to its shape and size, and searching for utensils left by the previous owners.
"Smells divine, I'm starving,"
Neil's voice echoed behind me. A pain took hold in my belly, hunger gripping me. Last night's food package was welcome but sparse.
It hadn't constituted what could be classed as a proper meal. 2 bags of crisps, 2 apples, half a baguette each, and a small slab of butter apiece. We had eaten ravenously, but awoke with empty bellies. He pulled out a chair and flopped into it like a man fatigued by life, then stood up again. "I'll make the coffee. I need it to wake me up. Still feel a bit out of sorts, if I'm being honest."
I knew what he meant. The sheer physicality and anxiety of the move had felt exhausting. I had to be honest and say that it was the anxiety that took it out of me, leaving me feeling washed out. I served up our food and watched as Neil poured the coffee from an old coffee pot we found last night. The dark liquid and swirl of the steam a bewitching sight. A pocket of calm surrounded us while we ate, the hiss of the boiler in the corner of the room drowning out the sound of cutlery scraping against crockery. There was no need to say anything, no pressure to initiate a forced conversation. The food helped, the tangle in my mind loosening with every forkful. A stark contrast to my mood last night, when the world felt like a darker, more hostile place. We finished our breakfast and I stood up, crockery balanced in my grip as I walked to the sink and dropped them in. I had just turned on the taps when I heard it. The sound sending a ripple of apprehension over my skin. It was unexpected. We didn't know anybody on the island and nobody knew us. Except they probably did. It's a small place, tongues wag. I felt sure plenty of people knew we were moving in. According to Mike, the only estate agent on the whole of Winter's End, it had been years since anybody new had come to live on the island, and I was almost certain he had informed locals about our imminent move here. The cottage had been empty for a couple of years, so I was willing to guess that us buying it would have been a major source of gossip in every shop and pub for miles around. Still, it didn't explain why somebody was knocking on our door at 8:30 on a Sunday morning. Whoever it was, I wished they would leave. I wasn't ready for visitors. It was early. I was still tired. No, not tired. Weary. That's what I was. Wearied by the move, the stress of it all. Wearied by my dreadful, calamitous mistake. I wore it like a second skin, my permanent fatigue. A person browbeaten by their own heinous crime. I wasn't ready for visitors. I wasn't yet ready to turn on charm I didn't have in order to greet people I didn't know. Before I could say or do anything, Neil was up on his feet, searching for the key that we had discarded late last night after locking up. I watched him sweep his hand across a shelf in the dining room and locate it, his fingers clutched around its small rectangular base.
"Come in,"
he shouted, frantically fiddling with the lock. He flung open the door and peered outside, his head moving from side to side as he searched for our mysterious caller. I waited, my chest tight, my breathing laboured, and watched as he stepped back inside, his face crumpled with confusion.
"I definitely heard somebody. You heard them as well, didn't you, Fee?"
A small gavel tapped at my temple. A pain shot up through my skull and lodged behind my eye, needle-like in its severity. I pushed Neil aside and stuck my head out. Nobody there. Something didn't feel right. I wasn't a fan of surprises, especially ones that disturbed me early on a Sunday morning. They can't get far, can they? We're only one of 3 houses on the lane. My voice rose an octave. I tried to hide it, the visceral tugging sensation that was swirling deep in my abdomen, the one that told me to beware. But it was difficult to shake, that overwhelming feeling that people were always going to think the worst of me, that they were going to do something terrible to make me pay for what I had done. Even with this amount of distance between me and my old life, that unshakable sense of dread
trailed around after me, a dead weight that refused to shift. I was tired of it, living my life on the cusp of near terror at being found out, having fingers pointed at me, eyes narrowed in disapproval. Neil smiled and shrugged his shoulders. Never mind. It was probably kids messing about or somebody who realised they'd got the wrong house. Sometimes, the way Neil dismissed things and explained them away as something they were clearly not irritated me beyond reason. I spun around and glared at him, fury mounting in me. Anger piled upon anger until it toppled like a Jenga stack. The wrong house? Neil, the entire island is populated by less than 100 people. It's early on a Sunday morning, everyone's in bed, and if they're not, then maybe they should be, not snooping around here spying on us. If my outburst shocked him, he hid it well. His face impassive, his movements fluid and measured. He stepped to one side and made to close the door. But then a sudden change in his demeanour, his expression altering. A lightness in his step, twinkling eyes, his mouth twitching in amusement. Something was coming then. I saw it, felt it in my gut and prepared myself. "Ah, that explains it," he said softly, squatting on his haunches, his hand sweeping down onto the concrete step and lifting something with one deft movement. I didn't ask what it was unable to. My heart was still thrashing around my chest, pulsating against my ribs, leaving me breathless and slightly dizzy. Instead, I waited until he stepped back inside, a small basket tucked under his arm. He kicked the door closed and turned to face me, his smile a sly, lopsided grin, his eyes glistening triumphantly. "Looks like we've got ourselves another little welcome package. Damn those neighbours being so cold and unfriendly towards us, eh? Makes me glad they decided not to have a lie-in." I ignored his sarcastic smile and underlying tone of self-satisfaction and peered over his shoulder, watching as he placed the small packet on the table and began unwrapping it, his fingers working at the cellophane packaging, casting it aside before lifting the basket to reveal the contents. 2 apples and a handful of grapes sat atop a mound of cream tissue paper, surrounded by a scattering of herbal tea bags, 2 fruit scones, a miniature pot of jam, and an envelope. Curiosity piqued, I reached over and grabbed it, aware that Neil was smirking at my sudden turnabout in mood. I pulled out the slip of paper from inside and opened it, holding it up to the light to get a better view of the tiny, impeccably neat handwriting, calligraphy in miniature. "Welcome to winter's end, where summers are brief and friendships are lasting." Neil was grinning. I didn't have to turn to see him. I could sense it, was able to feel the heat from his body and the weight of his small victory pressing down on me. He glanced at the message, eyes narrowed, before moving away to put the items into a cupboard. He at least had the decency to say nothing, to not dent my confidence even further by highlighting my impulsive behaviour and the maddening habit I have of jumping to the wrong conclusion and always assuming the worst. Expect the worst, then everything else is a bonus. Those words spiked me. A childhood memory of my dad and the swift but incisive ways he had of giving me perspective on life when I was a younger woman and bemoaning the lack of opportunities that came my way. Problem was, the worst had happened to us. I was still waiting for the bonus to show its face, to appear in a welcome flurry and elevate my circumstances and mood. Perhaps winter's end was the bonus, and I needed to start accentuating the positives. "Maybe once we've unpacked some more of our things, we can go for a walk around the village. Find out where everything is, show our faces and say a few hellos, eh?
I nodded and gave Neil a tight smile. My face felt stretched, like a too-tight blouse that was bursting at the seams. The unexpected knock on the door had shoved me off kilter. The rested sensation after a long and much-needed night's sleep had already dissipated. I was back to being jumpy, my body always on the cusp of being in a state of panic. A walk, though, sounded just right. The notion of wandering around the place anonymously gave me a warm glow. No sharp words, no pursed mouths, no set eyes boring their way into my soul. Neil told me I had imagined it all, that nobody knew about what had happened, but I didn't believe him. People gossip. It's a natural thing to do, to take a sharp interest in other people's misfortunes, to revel in the sins of others while thanking God their own lives are running smoothly. No bumps in the road, no unexpected deviations or reroutes. I probably would have done the same. I'm not in denial about what I did. It's there every morning when I wake, and it's the last thing I see each night before I close my eyes. My misdeeds have irrevocably shaped and changed my life, our lives. Me and Neil locked together in a lifetime of humiliation and contrition. I'll go and tidy up a bit, then we can get ready to go. A frisson of excitement bolted through me at the thought of it, being able to be somebody new, somebody different, somebody who wasn't the old me. A reinvention of the old Fiona. The dirty, tawdry one. The criminal. I could be a newer, fresher version, cleansed of my sins. I ambled through the cottage, the place we now called home. A 200-year-old blacksmith's forge that was so very different from our 4-bedroomed detached house in Saltburn, with its top-of-the-range fixtures and fittings, an abundance of things that we hadn't really needed. The original wooden flooring was warm beneath my feet. I padded from room to room, scanning the newness and unfamiliarity of each wall, each doorway, each window and shadowy corner. The place was surprisingly clean, with some rooms recently redecorated in pastel shades. It was an optical illusion, rooms seeming brighter and bigger than they actually were. With only 2 bedrooms, a living room, a small study, and a decent-sized kitchen diner, the cottage was a fraction of the size of our other property. But at least we could say it was all ours. No more huge debts hanging over our heads, no more sleepless nights wondering how we were ever going to pay for it all.
"Prosperity Cottage,"
Neil shouted through to me, his voice a buoyant sound amidst the silence of our tiny new home. I stopped walking. The fact he was able to read my mind, a chilling thought. Maybe he too was plagued by the dark thoughts that taunted me, both of our minds full of shadows of the past. A past we could have avoided but didn't. We chose our path in life, and this move here was the net result of those choices. Time to forget. To move on. I said nothing, but nodded. Maybe the name Prosperity Cottage would suit our new lifestyle. A healthy bank balance didn't always denote how rich people were. There were many different strands to happiness and a comfortable life that didn't revolve around money and possessions. We could be happy and content with less. Later, I would ruminate over those words, those thoughts, when our lives took a catastrophic turn. I would remember to never think that the worst was ever over, because it wasn't true. The bad things were still waiting for us.
Little did we know that an even darker period of our lives was waiting in the wings, about to make a grand appearance. Chapter 3.
Oh, you'll not find many of those around here, pet.
The man behind the counter shook his head, cast his eyes downwards. He reminded me of a small, frightened animal caught in a snare. His small hands rummaged in the carrier bag, rearranging tins of beans and loaves of bread.
You'll have to wait for the deliveries to come in from the mainland. I can put an order in for you if you like.
No, honestly, it's fine. I stifled a sigh, wondering why something as innocuous as a packet of bourbon biscuits would warrant a special request.
We tend to order what we know our customers like. Saves on wastage, you know,
he murmured, clearly able to read my thoughts. I held my card to the screen and listened to it beep. Relief bloomed in my chest. At least they had the facility for contactless payments. Our new home wasn't so far behind the rest of the world after all. Isolated geographically, but able at least to keep pace with technology.
Aye, we've managed to keep up with the latest gadgets here on Winter's End. We might be small, but we've got Wi-Fi and cable TV. Not so remote after all, eh?
I shivered and hunched my shoulders at this man's ability to read my mind, preempting my thoughts and questions with frightening accuracy.
So, you were here on holiday then, or?
I shook my head. I was sure he already knew the answer, was just being delicate and well-mannered, going through the motions of polite conversation. We've just moved here from the mainland. I was tempted to add, but I guess you already know that. I remained silent, waited for him to continue.
Ah, you'll be the couple that Mike's been talking about. Bought the old forge up on Harbour Lane.
I nodded, wondering how much he and the other locals knew about us, how much of our lives Mike had revealed to them. Not that we had told him anything, only that we were looking for a change. We're after a smaller house, and after seeing the cottage for sale online, decided to take a chance. Some of it was true. All of it, actually. Sometimes it's what people don't say that exposes who they really are. Silent souls are sinister. They make people dig deeper, look for the unknown, the unspoken. A Google search revealed little of our lives, our digital footprint minimal. I knew that because I had tried it. On several occasions. After it all happened, I became neurotic, convinced everybody outside our social circle knew what had taken place. I would sit hour after hour frantically typing in various permutations connected to our names and addresses, and was always relieved to find nothing of any substance. We immediately closed our social media accounts after the event and lived a low-key life, desperate to remain anonymous and unseen. The invisible people, that's what we became. Invisible, faceless individuals who hid behind a veil of shame. Moving here felt like the only way out of that life. A way of moving forward instead of living our lives in the abyss of a black hole that sucked us in and held us hostage with no visible means of escape. We were stuck in a groove. Every day I felt as if all eyes were upon us, judging me, judging us. No leniency or compassion, just puckered mouths and tight, unforgiving glances when they scurried past us, frightened of being tainted by association. I guess we didn't deserve any compassion. I was the face of our misdeeds, Neil's part in it concealed to many. Perhaps most of it was in my imagination. That's what I told myself every time I became weepy and weighed down with it all, convinced neighbours and locals could see inside my head to our misery and problems. "Nobody knows about it, Fee. They can't possibly know, can they?" Neil would say this to me time and time again, but it didn't alleviate any of my worries. So convinced was I of the transparency of my thoughts and expressions, my wrongdoings discernible to all. When I saw the cottage for sale online, it drew me in. It was a means of escape from the problems and anxieties that were running loose in my head, stampeding over rational thoughts, obliterating all reason.
"Hope you settle in okay. Winter's End is a small place. Can get pretty lonely up there on Harbour Lane. Where are you both from originally? You sound northern. Got a slight twang to your accent. Not quite like a northern dialect, is there?"
My insides shrivelled, knotting and squirming. Disguising our accents would have been impossible and draining, an intolerable burden to bear. "We're from the northeast. That obvious, eh?" I laughed, tried to shrug off the mantle of worry that perched on my shoulder. The northeast covers an area of just under 9,000 square kilometres, with a population of over 2.5 million. Why would this man know us? He couldn't see inside my head. He couldn't see my past, what I had done, my thieving, conniving ways. I picked up my bag of groceries and shuffled away from the counter, a sudden need to leave the shop pushing me on. I was wrong about getting out and exploring. I had misjudged it. I wasn't ready to mingle with the locals just yet. My nerves were still frazzled, always anticipating an accusatory remark or comment that I could feel slighted about. I was made of fresh air. One sharp breeze, one cutting remark, and I would be lifted off my feet and blown away, a stray leaf in the wind. Neil was waiting outside, squatting on his haunches, petting a dog that was tied up to the railings. "Ready?" I said, eager to be back indoors. I had changed my mind. Exploring the island could wait until I was feeling less jumpy, more confident of myself. The past was a heavy cloak to wear, constantly pushing me deep into the ground, driving me so low there were days when I felt as if I was being buried alive, the heavy wet loam sticking in my throat and choking me.
"This is Max,"
Neil said. He stroked the small spaniel, running his hand through its thick, straggly fur. The dog swivelled over onto its back and kicked its legs in the air.
"Isn't he a cutie? We should get one. This is the perfect territory for dog walking, for getting out and about and roaming around the place with a little canine friend by our sides."
I ignored this remark and began walking away, the carrier bag clutched tightly between my fingers. I could barely manage myself and my own needs, never mind taking on a dog that would need walking and feeding 3 times a day. Most days, putting one foot in front of another was an ordeal.
"Just moved in, have you?"
I jumped at the sound behind me and spun around to see Neil standing up, his hand outstretched to the tall man standing next to him. Annoyance prickled my scalp. I had no idea why such an innocent, harmless action irritated me as much as it did. Perhaps it was because he was trying too hard, straining every sinew to make a good impression with our new neighbours. He was making us conspicuous when all I wanted at that point was to be invisible.
"That's right,"
he answered, his voice cutting through the quiet morning air.
"I'm Neil, and this is my wife, Fiona."
Like the dutiful